Next up, Hume draws a distinction. He says some of these mental goings on represent matters of fact. Bunch of others, let's say, let's get rid of the chair for now, and look at like a mathematical equation like this, basic arithmetic. That kind of cognition does not represent a matter of fact. That's a matter of relations of ideas. My conceptual notion of two relates to itself via the mathematical operation of addition in such a way as to yield the notion of four. Very roughly. Okay, so the idea here is that the matters of fact are what Kant will later call both a posteriori and synthetic. Whereas relations of ideas are a priori and analytic. Now I said that Hume is skeptical about the relation of my sensory impressions to an external world, but for the purposes of this classification of our objects of knowledge, you might say that my knowledge of the chair is a knowledge of a matter of fact, or a knowledge, or like a judgment perhaps of a matter of fact, namely one about an externally existing chair. The skeptical part of it is I don't know whether there really is a chair out there. The philosophical epistemic part of it is that it represents the way the world is, and it is, for all I know, a form of adventitious knowledge, a posteriori. And it depends on something other than a priori relations, analytic relations between the contents of my thought. So, all right. And then Hume, for our purposes, and certainly in the inquiry, he goes that route, kind of goes on to ignore relations of ideas and focus his philosophical efforts on matters of fact. And now kind of explains the source and nature of his skepticism. And specifically, so how do we know matters of fact? And for the purposes of our class here, the kind of knowledge of matters of fact that Hume is particularly interested in is what he calls unobserved matters of fact. And cutting a long story short, Hume says, well, our knowledge of unobserved matters of fact, so for example, an effect that hasn't happened yet. I see the cause, the billiard ball running toward the other billiard ball, about to hit it, but I haven't seen the effect yet. I haven't seen the other one shooting off in the pocket quite yet. Or I've observed an effect, but I don't presently see the cause. Nevertheless, I assume that there's a cause there. So Hume wants to know on what grounds do we claim to have knowledge of these unobserved matters of fact. And Hume's answer is, how do I know it? Well, causation, causal principle. And Hume divides this into really two problems. There's a problem about inductive knowledge, and then there's a problem about the causal principle proper, if you will. Won't go into these details at this point. All I want to say is that Hume then brings to bear his conception of both my mental life is composed of impressions and ideas, and his conception of the distinction between matters of fact and relations of ideas, and says, my knowledge of causation is neither empirical knowledge nor is it a relation of ideas, nor is it rational knowledge. Now remember, causation was one of those metaphysical principles, the causal principle, that Descartes took for granted. Hume realizes that the causal principle is indeed mighty important, especially if you want to get you get yourself out of the pickle of Descartes' prison of the mind. If you want to kind of get around external world skepticism, nothing would be as useful as a thoroughly epistemically grounded causal principle. The difficulty that Hume raises for the causal principle specifically is that, look, actually turns out it's not justified. Why is it not justified? Well, it's not justified on Hume's conception of, actually, let me put the relations of ideas back in. It's not justified on Hume's conception of these two types of things being the only kinds of knowledge that we have. On the one hand, empirical, on the other hand, rational. My knowledge of causation is neither truly empirical nor truly rational. And so Hume says, since those are the only two types of knowledge available, my knowledge of causal relations is not rationally grounded at all. And he draws the skeptical conclusion that, we really don't know what grounds the causal principle has. His positive response then is, he doesn't stop there. His positive response is to say, all we can say about it, once again being good scientists of the mind, is, well, it seems to me that, especially for the case of the inductive case, certain types of objects tend to go together. The ones that we typically think of as causally related, the cause and its effect, well, I don't actually perceive the causation. Causation is not an empirical, it's not an a posteriori kind of knowledge. I don't actually observe a causal link in the world. But I do observe a pattern in the world. This type of thing goes with that type of thing. And so I form based on this pattern, I form a mental habit or a mental custom. And Hume says, how do I know? Or what is the nature of my causal reasoning? Why do I feel that there's a certain force behind it? Why do I think some relations in the world are truly causal relations, whereas other relations, other patterns in the world are merely accidental or correlations? Why is there a distinction in science between causation and correlation? Well, Hume says, just a matter of how stable the pattern is. The more stable the pattern, the more strong and forceful the psychological habit formed, and the more forceful then my notion of these things going together, and that's what we call the causal relation. All right, so Hume entirely naturalizes this causal relation and basically says, look, it's a psychological relation. That's all there is to the force and the strength of causal necessity. All right. Now that's the moment, as Kant himself puts it, that roused Kant, from his so-called, again he calls this so himself in the Prolegomena, from his dogmatic slumber. Because Kant fundamentally agrees with Hume's skeptical conclusion that we really don't have either a posteriori and synthetic knowledge of causal relations, nor do we have a priori and analytic knowledge of causal relations. So the skepticism seems justified according to Kant. What Kant doesn't like is this idea of reducing the causal principle, the vaunted metaphysical causal principle that Descartes thought was clear by the light of reason, reducing that to a mere psychological relation. And the thing that Kant takes issue with is this bifurcation that Hume takes for granted. This bifurcation of types of knowledge as either empirical, a posteriori and synthetic, or rational, a priori and analytic. And Kant will say, actually, this bifurcation, or Hume's fork, as it's called, is a mistake, because these two and these two don't always exclusively go together.